Ancient man and his first civilizations. The true Negro. The Berbers, Tuareg Moors of North Africa, Iberia, Spain and Portugal. The Iberian Peninsula, because of its close proximity to Africa, has been inhabited for at least 1 million years. At about 45,000 BC, the Khoisan-type African Romaldi became the first modern man to enter Europe. As he crossed the Gibraltar Straits and started his journey across Europe. Europe and Africa are now separated by 7.7 nautical miles. During glacial periods it was much less. During the Neolithic expansion, various megalithic cultures developed in Iberia. An open seas navigation culture from the East Mediterranean, probably from Crete, called the Cardian culture, also extended its influence to the eastern coasts of Iberia, possibly as early as the 5th millennium BC. In the Chalcolithic or Copper Age c. 3000 BC in Iberia, a series of complex cultures developed, which would give rise to the first civilizations in Iberia and to extensive exchange networks reaching to the Baltic, the Middle East and North Africa. At about 2150 BC, the Bell-Beaker culture intruded into Chalcolithic Iberia, being of Celtic origin. Around 1100 BC, Phoenician merchants founded the trading colony of Gadar or Gades, modern-day Cias, near Tartessus. In the 8th century BC, the first whites arrived. The Greeks established colonies such as Emporium, modern Empis. These were founded along the Mediterranean coast on the east, leaving the south coast to the Phoenicians. The Greeks are responsible for the name Iberia, after the river Ebro. In the 6th century BC, the Phoenician Carthaginians arrived in Iberia while struggling with the Greeks for control of the western Mediterranean. Their most important colony was Carthago Nova, Latin name of modern-day Cartagena. In 219 BC, the first Roman troops invaded the Iberian Peninsula, this during the Second Punic War against the Carthaginians. After 2 centuries of war with the Celtic and Iberian tribes, and also the Phoenician, Greek and Carthaginian colonies, Rome annexed it under Augustus, resulting in the creation of the province of Hispania. It was divided into Hispania Ulterior and Hispania Superior during the late Roman Republic, and during the Roman Empire, it was divided into Hispania Tarraconensis in the northeast, Hispania Baetica in the south and Lusitania in the southwest. In the early 5th century AD, new whites invaded. These were Germanic tribes from Eastern Europe, namely the Suevi, the Vandals, Silingi and Hostingi, and their allies, the Sarmatian Alans. Only the kingdom of the Suevi, Quadi and Marcomanni would endure after the arrival of another wave of Germanic invaders, the Visigoths, who had earlier established their own kingdom with its capital at Toulouse, France. They slowly extended their authority into Hispania, displacing the Vandals and Alans. The Visigoths subsequently conquered all of the Iberian Peninsula and expelled or partially integrated the Vandals and the Alans. The Visigoths eventually conquered the Suevi kingdom and its capital city Bracara, modern-day Braga, in 584–585 AD. They would also conquer the province of the Byzantine Empire, Spania, in the south of the peninsula and the Balearic Islands. White historians, in their bid to make ancient Europeans seem white, have chosen to ignore the obvious relationships that must have existed between Berbers and the people of Iberia. When Grimaldi crossed the Gibraltar Straits to enter Europe, all of his kind did not follow. When humans move to new territories, most stay behind in the old territory, and they maintain their relationships. There is always back and forth travel for trade and communication. It is against this backdrop that the Berber invasion of Iberia must be viewed. The Berbers did not enter Iberia as destroyers, they entered as builders. Thus, after Muhammad's Islamic army took Egypt in 640 AD and then went on to conquer all of North Africa, the Berbers no doubt saw this new black army as an opportunity. So rather than fight, the Berbers joined forces with the Islamic army. In 711 AD, a Berber army led by General Tariq ibn Ziyad invaded Iberia, Spain, and overthrew the White Visigoths, Western Goths, who were one of two main branches of the Goths, an East Germanic tribe, who over the period of only 100 years, had migrated from Eastern Europe, through Greece, through Italy, and finally down into the Iberian Peninsula. In Iberia, Spain, and Portugal, the Berbers, now known as Moors, created a highly advanced civilization and culture, famous for its art, architecture, and centers of learning. While having rule over Spain, the Berbers, who themselves 50 years earlier had been forced to accept Islam, now sometimes forced the inhabitants of Iberia to do the same. Though the number of original Moors remained small, many native Iberian inhabitants converted to Islam. According to Ronald Siegel, some 5.6 million of Iberia's 7 million inhabitants were Muslim by 1200 AD, virtually all of them native inhabitants. According to historian Richard A. Fletcher, the number of Arabs who settled in Iberia was very small. There were about 900,000 Berbers and about 90,000 Arabs in Iberia. Muslim Spain and European culture. When you think of European culture, one of the first things that may come to your mind is the Renaissance. Many of the roots of European culture can be traced back to that glorious time of art, science, commerce, and architecture. But did you know that long before the Renaissance there was a place of humanistic beauty in Muslim Spain? Not only was it artistic, scientific, and commercial, but it also exhibited incredible tolerance, imagination, and poetry. Moors, as the Spaniards called the Muslims, populated Spain for nearly 700 years. As you'll see, it was their civilization that enlightened Europe and brought it out of the Dark Ages to usher in the Renaissance. Many of their cultural and intellectual influences still live with us today. Way back during the 8th century, Europe was still knee-deep in the medieval period. That's not the only thing they were knee-deep in. In his book, The Day the Universe Changed, the historian James Burke describes how the typical European townspeople lived. The inhabitants threw all their refuse into the drains in the center of the narrow streets. The stench must have been overwhelming, though it appears to have gone virtually unnoticed. Mixed with excrement and urine would be the soiled reeds and straw used to cover the dirt floors. This squalid society was organized under a feudal system and had little that would resemble a commercial economy. Along with other restrictions, the Catholic Church forbade the lending of money, which didn't help get things booming much. Anti-Semitism, previously rare, began to increase. Money lending, which was forbidden by the Church, was permitted under Jewish law. Burke, 1985, pages 32, Jews worked to develop a currency although they were heavily persecuted for it. Medieval Europe was a miserable lot, which ran high in literacy, superstition, barbarism and filth. During this same time, Arabs entered Europe from the south. Abd al-Rahman I, a survivor of a family of caliphs of the Arab Empire, reached Spain in the mid-700s. He became the first caliph of Al-Andalus, the Moorish part of Spain, which occupied most of the Iberian Peninsula. He also set up the Umayyad dynasty that ruled Al-Andalus for over 300 years. Grolier, History of Spain. Al-Andalus means, the land of the Vandals, from which comes the modern name Andalusia. At first, the land resembled the rest of Europe in all its squalor. But within 200 years the Moors had turned Al-Andalus into a bastion of culture, commerce and beauty. Irrigation systems imported from Syria and Arabia turned the dry plains into an agricultural cornucopia. Olives and wheat had always grown there. The Arabs added pomegranates, oranges, lemons, aubergines, artichokes, cumin, coriander, bananas, almonds, palms, henna, woad, madder, saffron, sugar cane, cotton, rice, figs, grapes, peaches, apricots and rice. Burke, 1985, pages 37. By the beginning of the 9th century, Moorish Spain was the gem of Europe with its capital city, Cordova. With the establishment of Abdurrahman III the Great Caliphate of Cordova came the golden age of Al-Andalus. Cordova, in southern Spain, was the intellectual center of Europe at a time when London was a tiny mud hut village that could not boast of a single street lamp. Digest, 1973, pages 622. In Cordova there were 500,000 inhabitants, living in 113,000 houses. There were 700 mosques and 300 public baths spread throughout the city and its 21 suburbs. The streets were paved and lit. Burke, 1985, pages 38. The houses had marble balconies for summer and hot air ducts under the mosaic floors for the winter. They were adorned with gardens with artificial fountains and orchards. Digest, 1973, pages 622. Paper, a material still unknown to the West, was everywhere. There were bookshops and more than 70 libraries. Burke, 1985, pages 38. This rich and sophisticated society took a tolerant view towards other faiths. Tolerance was unheard of in the rest of Europe. But in Moorish Spain, thousands of Jews and Christians lived in peace and harmony with their Muslim overlords. Burke, 1985, pages 38. The society had a literary rather than religious base. Economically their prosperity was unparalleled for centuries. The aristocracy promoted private land ownership and encouraged Jews in banking. There was little or no Muslim proselyting. Instead, non-believers simply paid an extra tax. In another of James Burke's works titled Connections, he describes how the Moors thought out Europe from the Dark Ages. But the event that must have done more for the intellectual and scientific revival of Europe was the fall of Toledo in Spain to the Christians, in 1105. In Toledo the Arabs had huge libraries containing the lost to Christian Europe works of the Greeks and Romans along with Arab philosophy and mathematics. The Spanish libraries were opened, revealing a store of classics and Arab works that staggered Christian Europeans. Burke, 1978, pages 123. The intellectual plunder of Toledo brought the scholars of Northern Europe like moths to a candle. The Christians set up a giant translating program in Toledo. Using the Jews as interpreters, they translated the Arabic books into Latin. These books included most of the major works of Greek science and philosophy. along with many original Arab works of scholarship. Digest, pages 622. The intellectual community which the northern scholars found in Spain was so far superior to what they had at home that it left a lasting jealousy of Arab culture, which was to color Western opinions for centuries. Burke, 1985, pages 41. The subjects covered by the texts included medicine, astrology, astronomy, pharmacology, psychology, physiology, zoology, biology, botany, mineralogy, optics, chemistry, physics, mathematics, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, music, meteorology. Christians and Muslims. Soon after, Christian states based in the north and west slowly, in fits and starts, began a process of expansion and reconquest of Iberia over the next several hundred years. The end for the Moors came on January 2, 1492. The leader of the last Moorish city, Granada, located in southern Spain, surrendered to armies of a recently united Christian Spain after the marriage of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. This ended the 800-year reign of the Moors in Iberia. The surrender of Granada. By some historical accounts, in 1491, Muhammad Xi was summoned by Ferdinand and Isabella to surrender the city of Granada, and on his refusal it was besieged by the Castilians. Eventually, on 2 January, 1492, Granada was surrendered. In most sumptuous attire, the royal procession moved from Santa Fe to a place a little more than a mile from Granada, where Ferdinand took up his position by the banks of the Genil. A private letter written by an eyewitness to the Bishop of La only 6 days after the event recorded the scene. With the royal banners and the cross of Christ plainly visible on the red walls of the Alhambra, he Moorish Sultan with about 80 or 100 on horseback very well dressed went forth to kiss the hand of their highnesses. According to the final capitulation agreement, both Isabel and Ferdinand will decline the offer and the key to Granada will pass into Spanish hands without Muhammad Xi having to kiss the hands of Los Roys, as the Spanish royal couple became known. Muhammad Xi's indomitable mother insisted on sparing his son this final humiliation. The Moorish Sultan was received with much love and courtesy, and there they handed over to him his son, who had been a hostage from the time of his capture, and as they stood there, there came about 400 captives, of this who were in the enclosure, with the cross and a solemn procession singing the Te Deum Laudamus, and their highnesses dismounted to adore the cross to the accompaniment of the tears and reverential devotion of the crowd, not least of the Cardinal and Master of Santiago and the Duke of Cadiz and all the other grandees and gentlemen and people who stood there, and there was no one who did not weep abundantly with pleasure, giving thanks to our Lord for what they saw, for they could not keep back the tears. And the Moorish Sultan and the Moors who were with him for their part could not disguise the sadness and pain they felt for the joy of the Christians, and certainly with much reason on account of their loss, for Granada is the most distinguished and chief thing in the world. Christopher Columbus seems to have been present. He refers to the surrender on the first page of his Diario de los Derrotas y Caminos, after your highnesses ended the war of the Moors who reigned in Europe, and finished the war of the great city of Granada, where this present year 1492, on the 2nd January I saw the royal banners of your highnesses planted by force of arms on the towers of the Alhambra, which is the fortress of the said city. I saw the Moorish Sultan issue from the gates of the said city, and kiss the royal hands of your highnesses. Exile. Legend has it that as the royal party moved south toward exile, they reached a rocky prominence which gave a last view of the city. Muhammad Xi reined in his horse and, surveying for the last time the Alhambra and the green valley that spread below, burst into tears. When his mother approached him she said, "Weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." The spot from which Muhammad Xi looked for the last time on Granada is known as the Moors Las Últimos Suspiro del Moro. It's probably not true, as we know, white people do tend to lie. Muhammad Xi was given an estate in El Jarda and Arax, Los Alpujarras, a mountainous area between the Sierra Nevada and the Mediterranean Sea, but he soon crossed the Strait of Gibraltar to Fez, Morocco. The Spanish royal secretary Fernando de Zafra mentions in his letter of December 9, 1492 that Muhammad Xi and his followers leave Andarax, which left 1 month to go to Lemson, where he stayed little longer. He left in September or October 1492. He explained that his wife died in Andarax is that it is buried in Mandar. The remaining Muslims and Turkish Khazar Jews not Hebrews of Iberia were forced to leave Iberia or die, or convert to Roman Catholic Christianity. Many of the Khazar Jews who were expelled from Spain and Portugal immigrated to Holland, where they set up the Dutch West Indies Company, a prime mover in the Atlantic slave trade. Ironically, 8 months after the last Moorish city fell, it was in the nearby town of Palos, on the evening of August 3, 1492, that Christopher Columbus would depart from Palos on his journey to the Americas. One result of which would be the Spanish and Portuguese Atlantic slave trade. The story of black slavery in the Americas, of course, begins with Christopher Columbus. It is alleged that his voyage to the Americas was not financed by Queen Isabella, but rather by the Khazar Jew Luis de Santangelo, who supposedly advanced the sum of 17,000 ducats to finance the voyage. Columbus was accompanied by 5 Maranish Jews who had forsworn their religion and supposedly became Catholics: Luis de Torres, the interpreter; Marco, the surgeon; Bamel, the physician; Alonso de la Calle and Gabriel Sanchez, and a black navigator, Pedro Alonso Nye 1468-1505. It is not known if Pedro Alonso Nye was a Moor or a native Gaul of Iberia. While in the Americas, it was Gabriel Sanchez who convinced Columbus to capture 500 American Indians and sell them as slaves in Seville, Spain, after the Moors were gone. In 1480, Isabella and Ferdinand instituted the Inquisition in Spain, as one of many changes to the role of the Church instituted by the monarchs. The Inquisition was aimed mostly at Jews and Muslims who had overtly converted to Christianity but were thought to be practicing their faiths secretly, called respectively Morenos and Moriscos. The Inquisition also attacked heretics who rejected Roman Catholic orthodoxy, including Alumbrous native people who practiced a personal mysticism or spiritualism. They represented a significant portion of the peasants in some territories, such as Aragon, Valencia or Andalusia. In the years from 1609 to 1614, these people were systematically expelled from the country. However, many of them were converted to Christianity. This is clearly indicated by a high mean proportion of ancestry from North Africa, 10.6%, that attests to a high level of religious conversion, whether voluntary or enforced. At the end of the Reconquista, it is estimated that about a third of the Moorish population had been killed or enslaved, another third immediately left, while a third tried to live in Christian Spain. However, for most Moors, the persecution and forced conversion to Catholicism of the Muslim population during the time of the Christian Reconquista caused a mass exodus. Many found life under Christian rule intolerable and passed over into North Africa. This is considered the main reason why the number of Muslims had shrunk to a relatively small fraction of the total population by 1500. The defeat of the Moors was of course a great moment in white history. It was duly commemorated in the coat of arms and flags of many former kingdoms of the Moors. Meanwhile, in Egypt, 935 AD ushered in the Ikhshidid dynasty of Muhammad ibn Tughj, a Turk from Uzbekistan in Central Asia. But the Ikhshidid dynasty was usurped by their Abyssinian slave tutor named Kafur. He ruled Egypt with the caliphate sanction until his death in 968 AD. Kafur wisely forsook white Turkish troops, and instead used Berbers as the mainstay of his army.